Why did Ghana become such a central part of the transatlantic slave trade? It wasn't because Africans were weak, careless, or waiting to be taken. It happened because this land was already deeply connected to global trade, long before the rise of slavery. And over time, those trade connections were slowly twisted into something far more brutal. Long before enslaved people were taken from these shores, the coastal region of modern-day Ghana was already known to Europeans for gold. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors arrived, not searching for people, but for wealth. And they didn't stumble onto Africa by chance. They followed well-established African trade routes. African merchants controlled gold production inland. Coastal middlemen controlled access to the sea. Europeans couldn't simply explore at will. They relied on African systems. This early contact led to a permanent European presence along the coast. Forts were built, not to rule the land, but to secure trade. These were controlled spaces where Europeans waited, negotiated, and stored goods. At this point, gold, not people, was still the focus. But everything changed when Europe's colonies in the Americas began to expand. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, tobacco farms in North America, cotton fields in the American South, all demanded massive labor forces. Indigenous populations were dying from violence and disease, and European powers needed a new labor source, one that could survive tropical conditions and be used in large numbers. That need fueled the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. Ghana became central because it had three things Europe required: a long, accessible coastline, strong trade networks, and well-organized inland political systems that Europe couldn't conquer directly, but could influence. In the beginning, Europeans didn't march inland capturing people. They didn't know the terrain, the languages, or the politics. Instead, they relied on African intermediaries, and this is where the system turned deadly. Some African rulers and merchants became involved, not because slavery was new, but because this version was different. In earlier African societies, war captives might be used for labor or integrated into communities. But this new system removed people permanently, cutting them off from land, family, and identity. The main method of capture was warfare and raids. As European demand grew, some African leaders began launching military campaigns just to seize captives. Firearms supplied by Europeans shifted the balance of power. Kingdoms with guns gained advantage. Conflict escalated, and wars that once had political aims became human supply chains. Local agents played key roles. Brokers operated between inland captors and coastal forts. They organized transport, holding areas, and coordinated with European ships. Captives were marched, often in chains, from inland regions to the coast. Many died before they ever saw the ocean. European traders encouraged instability. They rewarded certain chiefs, withheld weapons from others, and created dependency through debt. Alcohol, guns, cloth, and metal goods were exchanged for people. Europeans recorded it as trade. Africans experienced it as loss. Forts like Elmina Castle and Cape Coast Castle became processing centers, not just trading posts. Captives were brought through organized routes, not at random. African guards often controlled the outside. Europeans controlled the inner chambers and the ships. Inside, people were sorted by age, strength, and sex, branded, inspected, held in dark, crowded spaces until the ships arrived. Once moved to the ships, control shifted completely into European hands. This system expanded because it was profitable for powerful people on both sides of the coast, but for ordinary communities, it was devastating. Villages were emptied, families torn apart, trust between neighbors collapsed. Even those not taken lived in fear of attack. Ghana became central not because it was passive, but because it was strategically important, already connected to the world. Europeans exploited those connections. Some African leaders benefited in the short term. Most Africans suffered forever. By the time resistance began to grow, the system was deeply rooted. Forts had become permanent. Ships came regularly. Weapons had reshaped warfare. What began as trade had become an industry built on human lives. This is why Ghana became central to the transatlantic slave trade, not because history began here, but because history had already made this land important long before slavery arrived. And this takes us straight into the next episode, because knowing why Ghana became central is only part of the story. The true horror begins when we step inside the places where human beings were stored, controlled, and prepared for the ocean crossing. What happened inside those walls was hidden from the world, but its echoes are still with us today. In the next episode, we enter Ghana's slave castles. We'll talk about how people were held, how long they stayed, what they endured, and why so many never left alive. Once you hear that story, you'll never look at Elmina Castle or Cape Coast Castle the same way again.